Good morning to the people who are here in the audience and also to the many people who are following us online. We're very happy to introduce the symposium and the book. The book is out. Here it is, Designing Modernity, Architecture in the Arab World, صوغ الحداثة العمارة في العالم العربي, 1945-1973. With Philipp Oswalt, we are very happy to share this project with you, which is a 2-year research and collaboration with the authors. We will have a 2-day symposium. The first theme is diverse forms of transculturality, which is this session. We have another session on knowledge production for modern heritage in 2 sessions, one about archives, the second about research. We'll also have tomorrow a session on activism for preservation, political and civic engagement, protest and civic engagement. Another session, the last session on renovation, modernization and updating, issues of adaptive reuse, recycling of building restoration will be addressed. And the last session tomorrow is the launch of the book, tomorrow at 6 p.m. I will moderate this session with my colleague, Janset Shawash, who's here. I will introduce Janset first. Janset is an assistant professor in the School of Architecture and Built Environment at German Jordanian University. Her research focuses on the history and theory of architecture, urban planning, and design, especially in relation to the conceptualization of architectural heritage, identity, and belonging. So she kindly accepted to co-moderate this session with me. People will be allowed to have questions in the chat. They can also, of course, put comments of interest to everyone. I will here introduce our first speaker, Mohamed Elshahed. You have also on the panel here, Sara Saragoça, Philipp Oswalt, and we have online Łukasz, Stanek, and Panayoti Paila. We start with Mohamed Elshahed. The format is the following. We will have 2 people presenting, and then we will open a little, like 5 or 10 minute questions and answers or comments. But we will leave, of course, we have an hour at the end of this session to address more issues with everyone. Mohamed Elshahed is the author of Cairo Since 1900, a book he published in 2020. It's an architectural guide at the AUC Press. He's the curator of the British Museum's Modern Egypt project and the winning pavilion at the 2018 London Design Biennale, Modernist Indignation. In 2011, he initiated Cairo Observer, a platform for reconsidering architecture, heritage, and cities from the vantage point of Cairo. Mohamed, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, George and Philip, for involving me in the project and inviting me to Berlin. So I'll speak for maybe just about 10 minutes about Sayyid Karim to introduce him. And I was asked to talk about the notion of Sayyid Karim as a pan-Arab architect. So let me start with, are the images up there? Oh. Because I see it here, but maybe not there. I'm showing his business card, which is interesting. It has 3 addresses on it. One is his office in Cairo, which is in downtown. And the other address is his home, which is in the district suburb of Garden City. And then there's a 3rd address in the bottom, which says Crucial States, Abu Dhabi, which is already a very interesting indication of his sort of regional aspirations. What we know is that Sayyid Karim had several offices at some point in other places in the region. Unfortunately, that the details of this information have yet to be uncovered. The fact that it says Crucial States, we know that this card is from before 1971, when the Crucial States were no longer called the Crucial States, became the United Arab Emirates. But I should also say that I already knew that this would be before 1971, because Sayyid Karim's career abruptly ended in 1965 or around that time. And I'll mention this towards the end of maybe some hypothesis as to one of the reasons why this happened. So the middle address that was on that business card, this is his house. I'm just showing here what he published when he designed the house in the late 1940s. He published it in his own magazine, which I'll mention shortly. And this is a photo of him with his wife and sister at the kitchen, serving area between the kitchen and the dining room in his house. And the house is interesting because when I say that his career abruptly ended in 1965, he was actually put under house arrest. So this is actually where he spent a great chunk of his life. And one of the big questions here is, how is it that someone who was born in 1911 and lived to 2005 had his career abruptly end in 1965? And how does that relate to not only his regional aspirations, but also his various projects in Egypt itself? Just very quick biographical notes. Sayyid Karim was born in the province of Munufiyya, which is in the Delta. This is where a lot of sort of prestigious families in Egypt came from. His father was a minister of public works and involved in the government. And so he already comes from a kind of a prestigious, relatively prestigious background, which allowed him to, after completing an architecture degree at Cairo University, to go to Zurich. And this is maybe one of the first instances that I'll mention here, where he encountered, where politics and his life kind of jam against each other. The reason I say this is he arrived in ETH Zurich in 1933. Which is probably not a great time to be an Arab immigrant in Europe for obvious reasons, and fascism and the rise of everything that was happening in the years leading up to World War II. And when I went to ETH Zurich, I saw that in the paperwork that is still in the archive, it shows that not only was he taking classes as soon as he arrived, but these classes didn't count toward his degree for the first year, because essentially he had to prove that as an Arab, he's able to perform academic studies in Switzerland. So there's obviously racism involved there. And we see another encounter of the sort later on. But first of all, let me just mention quickly that one of the, for those who don't know Sayyid Karim, and I think many people in this room probably do, but just to recap, his significance goes beyond him being an architect, a practicing architect, but also being an editor and publisher and polemicist and writer. He published what we think is the first Arabic language magazine on on design of architecture, and Mercedes Voulay did a great book which basically compiles. This is how I got to learn about the magazine as I started to do this research. So this is one of the interesting significance of this architect. And the magazine is 1939. And now that I'm based in Latin America, I'm looking at what was happening in Latin America at the same time. And it's very interesting to see parallels at the very same time with very similar ideas. But he also published books. I'm showing here Ishtirakiyat al-Villa, the socialism of the villa, which was a compilation of his projects proposed and built up until this point in 1952 or thereabouts. And it's a self-published book. Just to show a couple more magazine covers from Al-Imara. And I'm not going to go into great detail of specific projects, but I just want to show you a variety of the types of works that he did in Egypt. These are three very different projects. One on the right is for a newspaper. On the left, the newspaper, these are all from roughly the decade of the 1950s. So the newspaper is somewhere around just at the cusp of the 1950s, 1950 or so. And then the building on the left on top is headquarters for the leading political party at the time, the Arab Socialist Union, later in the 50s. And then on the bottom is a housing complex of three blocks, two of which were built. The project was built actually twice in Cairo. So there's one version of the project with the two buildings on the right. And then there's another version in Cairo also of the two buildings on the left, which is very interesting. So we never have the complete project, but we have two half-finished projects of the same project. And these are some of his private commissions from the late 40s for apartment buildings in downtown Cairo. And here's another one that was unbuilt. So a lot of housing, and this is housing for workers in the city of Suez or outside of Suez. But beyond his work in Egypt and after World War II, Sayyid Karim had a very interesting aspiration, which is to actually go beyond Egypt. One of his biggest complaints in Egypt, and we see it in his own magazine in the 40s in his editorials, is that there weren't big clients who would do the visions that he had. So basically he was hoping that a king or a prince or something would take on his projects and adopt them so he can materialize them. But after World War II, in order to go beyond this, he looked to the new sort of states or still states in formation across the region, and he tried to do projects in several places. But he was able to do this. I'm showing here a print house, a press house in Jeddah from 1952, which is pretty interesting, I think, given the context. And he did several of these types of publishing houses and also ministerial buildings in Kuwait, Abu Dhabi, in the Emirates, what became the Emirates. But also he has projects that we know of in Amman, in Jordan. He did urban plans for parts in Palestine, for Baghdad. And here I'm showing one of his housing projects from 1946 that was proposed for New Baghdad. A lot of these projects that I'm showing and much of what he's done, and he's a very prolific architect in the sense that he produced so much. And so in that context, not all of it was built, but there's quite a heavy volume. And considering also that his career was actually relatively short. So this is housing complex from New Baghdad, 1946. And in parallel to that, he developed New Damascus, for which this housing tower was part of the plan. And you can see already this vision that he's developing here in right after World War II that we see manifest in other of his projects, including the one that I wrote about in this book. He also has hypothetical projects. For example, this is a city, a modular city for 1 million people, and is built around cells. And you can see here, for example, the idea of an external ring road and an internal ring road. And then within each, I mean, as a side anecdote, if you look at Google Maps on the new capital that Sisi is building in Egypt today, the Ministry of Defense, which interestingly has been called the Octagon, because we already have a pentagon in the world. And so, but there's not one octagon, there's 8 octagons, and they're actually arranged in the same arrangement. That side note, which is interesting because the state that is building that kind of vision today, which is completely unrelated to Sayyid Karim, is the same state that destroyed his career. But let's go back to this city of 1 million people, which could be multiplied hypothetically. And this is one of sort of the housing. I mean, I'm very lucky that I was able to find some of this material in his paperwork and elsewhere. But what's interesting is at the same time, he also looked far beyond the Arab world. This is a project that he proposed for Caracas in South America, which was unrealized. And a lot of this work in the late 40s after World War II was done as a consultant for the UN. And this is the housing project that I worked on for this book, which is Model 33. It's a very interesting model. This individual building is actually 3 separate buildings in many ways, connected. And then there's 5 of those. And you can see the theme of multiplicity here that he developed for projects elsewhere in the Arab world sort of manifest back in Cairo with this project, where this idea of modularity and repetition is manifest. This project was part of Nasr City, and I just want to end with an important note here, because just to bring it all together, you can see the building blocks on the bottom, and this is a brochure that was done for the promotion of the city. But what I want you to look at is the center of the plan, which has a stadium. So as someone, like I mentioned before, who was looking for big sponsors or clients for his projects, a big city. This is contemporaneous with both Chandigarh and Brasilia. It's planned hypothetically without a client in the early 50s and then manifested later on under the auspices of the state. However, the main project, maybe one important point here, in the late 50s, in the 1958 Brussels Expo, which was the first expo big expo after World War II, he also designed a pavilion that represented 6 Arab nations. So clearly he was kind of seen as someone who can take on the role of the pan-Arab architect, which is interesting also because the local architects and a lot of the other contexts that he worked in, like in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere, complained about him being an outsider. And this is a typical kind of storyline. But what I want to end with is the fact that the stadium, which is at the center of his plan, his masterpiece in many ways, the design for that commission was taken away from him and mysteriously went to Werner Mark, who designed the 1936 Olympic Stadium here in Berlin, which are sort of famous to be sort of the Nazi Olympics. So there is a kind of a big question mark as to how did this potentially grand architect with grand visions, pan-Arab practices, this big city plan, his centerpiece gets taken away from him. And I think this is where I was hoping that we can talk more about in the discussion of how his career ended in 1965, the stadium being taken away from him in late 50s, early 60s, it's kind of related to this, and the networks of architects and the relationship to, well, his own relationship with the state, but also just generally with politics that allowed his career to prosper at one point, but end at another. So pan-Arab architect, big question mark, we can discuss further. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Sara Saragoça, who is an architect and a researcher, and she holds a Master's of Arts in Building Conservation and Urban Rehabilitation from the Lisbon School of Architecture, where she worked on her thesis, which is called The Identity of Modern Heritage, Kuwait City. In 2014, she integrated the curatorial team for the Kuwait national participation at Venice Biennale of Architecture and the national delegation at the 38th session of the World Heritage Committee. In 2016, she was a TA at Kuwait University, College of Architecture. She is also the co-author of the publications Modern Architecture Kuwait, 1949 until 1989, volumes 1 and 2, and Pan-Arab Modernism, 1968 to 2018. The History of Architectural Practice in the Middle East, which was published in 2020. So her talk will be on Kuwait as a regional platform, a pioneer for the Gulf. Please go ahead.
It's working? Yes. Thank you, George and Philip, for the invitation to this project. In response to growing independence aspirations, architecture and planning were called to organize and articulate a new country's identity that could sustain the state formation. In 1951, with the approval of the first master plan by the British firm Minoprius Spenceley and Macfarlane, Kuwait would soon begin its transformation into an emerging cultural center. The tabula rasa condition made Kuwait an open field where architecture and design as a whole was provocative, experimental, and imaginative. In the early 50s, hundreds of different types of buildings were commissioned to foreigner expertise. John Harris got his first overseas appointment with the design of the Kuwait Research Laboratories, pioneer in the Middle East for testing materials according to local physical conditions. Also, an intensive program of construction schools took place under the British firm Tribe and Wacom, who were asked to design the best schools in the world. And as for Said Karim, it was requested the concept for the most cinema buildings. Also, the Kuwait National Museum, the first international architecture competition in the country, was understood as part of the country's nation building even before Kuwait's independence in 1961, under a program that could promote education knowledge implemented by the Syrian archaeologist Selim Abdullah. As the Palestinian architect Al-Shahid remembered in his last interview, when I arrived to Kuwait in 1956, the nature of the country, the desert, and the way the initial construction happened was not conducive to developing the old society again or improving it. It wasn't. The idea that everyone was willing to accept the demolition of the pre-oil landscape while dreaming of a better future, it was a conscious act that made Kuwait the perfect platform to test and explore new models and ideas on a massive scale. And even if many of these proposals hadn't been built, it was a way to transfer that experience to other contexts. Different typologies of large-scale housing schemes were developed as agriculture and Bedouin settlements, and several layouts of neighborhood unities were tested under the logic of the functional city, forcing local actors to become more planners rather than architects. Also, large-scale urban operations explored new relations between town planning and architecture, as the ones presented in the urban form studies for the old city in the late 60s. Those proposals brought a new agenda under the concepts of mass building, megastructure, and habitat unities. The relevance of Kuwait as a platform for the Gulf region modern architecture production involved in two different ways. The first, by commission foreigner well-known architects in the context of a major public works enterprise built on the need to erect a new state. Second, the need for an average production locally based, responding to fast-growing motivations, as Saba George exposed in his seminal publication, Kuwait Urbanization, was the right context for the establishment of local-based corporate practice of architecture and engineer, which absorbed designers from all over the region to work and live in Kuwait. The shared vision and collaborative work of young Arab architects and international experts in modern architecture and city planning produced a new architectural culture that moved beyond the dominant narrative of an architecture that was simply a product of the importation of Western models to a passive recipient. Kuwait facilitated the production of a pan-Arab landscape through fostering exchanges with architects and firms from Egypt, Iraq, Lebanon, and Palestine. In turn, the architecture built through these exchanges, and even those with Western firms, was rather born from local places, practices, and knowledge. Thank you.
I'd like to respond very briefly to the two speeches. I will start with the last one, actually, because of this idea of Kuwait not being, on one hand, the recipient of an important model, nor on the other, a place where this issue of identity that started to invade our minds after many years was at the center. So it's neither this or that. There was a sort of rational position. I would like you to tell me if I'm right about that, which was to try to take what was best in this transcultural exchange.
Yes. Yeah, in the first stage, when I started my research about Kuwait, I thought, as many people, that was just Western models and Western architects making a country. But moving forward on the research, I realized that that was not really like that. So Kuwait was a recipient of massive immigration from other parts of the region, mainly from the Palestine, because of Nakba and also the Suez crisis. And they were deeply involved in they were working at the Baladia, at public institutions. So they were really important on taking part of the development and building this new country. So there was really a work that was an exchange of experience and knowledge between the Western side and also the local side. And we cannot forget that Kuwait, when they demolished the old city, it was like an open field. And everyone was willing to accept that and to build a new country. Even the locals, they opened their arms to that demolition because they were thinking about a better future. Modernization was that better future.
Yeah, thank you. And to Mohamed, my question is, who was behind the scenes? Because we see Sayyid Karim or Karim everywhere. I suppose somebody was trying to promote him. I mean, there must have been a team of people trying to get these projects here and there and trying to convince that this architect is the appropriate one, having on one hand the expertise learned in the West, but also being an Arab architect. So what can you tell us about that? Did he have the time himself to go and look for clients and so on?
I didn't get a chance to meet Sayyid Karim. I know Mercedes did, but also because of his storyline, you know, and the fact, well, that his career really abruptly stopped in the 60s. By the time anybody got to talk to him, I don't know, later on, I think we don't really have all the full details, but from my impression, I think no one would have promoted, like he's the best promoter for himself in many ways. I mean, he was very clear about this with establishing the magazine, and actually the magazine produced a range of other magazines by people who either worked directly in the office or were influenced by what he was doing. And a lot of his projects, because they were so present, at least private commissions, ended up circulating in these magazines. On top of that, he wrote in general, which is very interesting, I think, and relevant for today. He wrote in general reading magazines that are targeted towards a general audience. And he would write on a wide variety of issues, from urban complaints to his ideas about history. So he's really out there in terms of, it's kind of difficult to see the amount of work that we know of his practice, and to know that this is only a small drop in the bucket, and to imagine that one person or one office produced all of this, and only in the range of 20 years out of a much longer life. It's hard to believe that he was a self-promoting person, but that is my impression. And I say this, I think, to answer your question is very relevant, because ironically, it is the search for a sponsor or someone to push his agenda further with political power that really dominated a lot of what he seemed to be interested in. He was very aware that a lot of these projects would need political power to be implemented. What's interesting here is that he wasn't, as far as I know, pushed by, let's say, the Egyptian government to go and do work elsewhere. However, his career ended because other governments were doing this with their architects. So as the Middle East opened up as a new terrain for architectural experimentation and so on and development, embassies of many, mostly the US and European countries, were promoting their consultants, engineers, and architects and planners. And this is how actually Werner Mart ends up in Cairo to take the centerpiece of his urban design. He was being pushed by his embassy. And this actually happens until today. In fact, I think it's important for us to talk about how embassies play a role in pushing consultants and architects in certain fields. And
we will certainly hear about that with the Panayota Paila and also with Łukasz Stanek. It seems we have a comment from the audience. Or a question?
Yes, there is a question from Mohamed Gohar, if I pronounce correctly. So the question is to Mohamed: why Alexandria city has not its share of Sayyid Karim's work, do you think?
You know, I'm Alexandrian, and I don't know why Alexandria doesn't have shared my work either. I'm not sure. I think he does have private buildings, commissions, residential mostly, but I think there's also some public buildings maybe that he's done or some participate. But actually, Alexandria is completely out of his vision, it seems. It doesn't really appear much in his magazine and in his proposed projects. I'm not sure if I have an answer for that, but it's important to note that, yes, he was Cairo to the rest of the region as opposed to the rest of the country first, as far as we know. He does have projects in the south and other provincial locations within Egypt, but Alexandria, that the comment is correct, is underrepresented.
Thank you. Our next speaker, Łukasz Stanek, when Baghdad was like Warsaw. Łukasz Stanek is professor of architecture history at the University of Manchester, UK, and senior fellow at the Maria Sibylla Merian Institute for Advanced Studies in Africa, University of Ghana at Legon, Accra. Stanek authored Henri Lefebvre on space architecture, urban research, and the production of theory. and Architecture in Global Socialism, Eastern Europe, West Africa, and the Middle East in the Cold War in 2020. Łukasz, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, George. Let me share my screen. And thank you for having me while I'm still in Accra. So my short presentation today is based on the book that George just mentioned, which is published in 2020. The book is titled Architecture and Global Socialism, Eastern Europe, West Africa, and the Middle East in the Cold War. And the book discusses the collaboration between architects, planners, and construction companies from socialist countries and from several newly independent countries from the 1950s to the 1980s. And as you can see from this table of contents, it is a portrait of 5 cities in specific periods of time. 2 among them are located in West Africa, namely Accra and Lagos, and 3 others in the Middle East, including Baghdad, Abu Dhabi, and Kuwait City. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about the latter 3. During the Cold War, socialist countries, together with newly independent countries, formulated a range of visions of global cooperation and solidarity, some of which were alternative to the ones from the West. In the 1950s and the 1960s, the socialist model of development was promoted by the Soviet Union. It promised fast-track economic development and broad welfare distribution. And as such, it was accepted in the Middle East by several governments with socialist sympathies or proclivities. And that included Iraq after the 1958 coup, led by Colonel Karim, which toppled the pro-Western monarchy. And on the right, you could see some Soviet projects in Iraq. Furthermore, Eastern European countries, beyond the discourse, the specific discourse of socialist internationalism, Eastern European countries claimed that they shared with the newly independent countries, such as Iraq, longer historical experiences of independence struggle, nation building, and modernization. And for instance, Polish architects and planners working in Baghdad often referred to the experience of Polish cities since the 19th century, and in particular, when working in Baghdad, to the reconstruction of Warsaw after World War II. In Iraq, these exchanges resulted in a number of buildings designed and built by the Soviets, but also by actors from Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria, in collaboration with Iraqi actors, both public and private. And here, for instance, you can see the Mustansiriya University in Baghdad, which was designed by the Iraqi architect Kakhtanowny in collaboration with the Polish architect Lech Robaczyński. However, in the mid-1970s, in the wake of the global oil crisis, followed by the debt crisis in Eastern Europe, many socialist countries began to emphasize mercantile aims of architectural mobilities. And this was really the primary motivation of the engagements in the Middle East by the late 1970s and in the 1980s. Yet, as I argue in my book, these engagements were prepared by a longer history of connections in the frameworks of socialist internationalism. And that argument is, I developed that argument in 2 chapters. The chapter on Baghdad discusses the ways in which the work of Eastern Europeans and Iraqi architects, planners, and contractors was shaped by the political economy of foreign trade and state socialism. In particular, I am interested in the space, in the liminal space in which they operated, namely at the border between, on the one hand, the emerging global market of design and construction services dominated by Western actors, and on the other hand, the political economy of foreign trade and socialism and its specific principles. And I'm developing this argument by looking at 2, I think, really interesting projects in Baghdad. And the first is what you are looking at now, which is the master plan of Baghdad by the Polish-Iraqi team. And for example, I'm showing how the team benefited from the manipulation of the exchange rates of Polish currency by state socialist institutions. And I argue that that resulted in specific conditions of labor of the planning team that facilitated their way of work a production of the master plan that was more embedded, empirical, consultative, and scenario-based. And namely, it is an industrial slaughterhouse, an abattoir in Baghdad. It was designed by East Germans, but it was constructed by Romanians. And by focusing on this case study, I am discussing the principle of petrobarter, or the exchange of crude oil for goods and services, including buildings, petrobarter being a really important way in which architectural mobilities were performed between the socialist countries and several oil-producing countries in the region. And that case study allows me to talk about the division of labor that took place between state socialist actors in the Middle East, but also, and quite importantly, it allows me to talk about the competition between them. A competition which, of course, contradicted the principles of socialist internationalism and the official discourse of the socialist countries more general. And that competition characterized the work of state socialist actors in the Gulf in the 1980s, which is the focus on the last chapter of my book. It discusses buildings such as this one, which is the Municipality and Town Planning Department in Abu Dhabi. It was designed by a Bulgarian company, and it was constructed in 1985 by a number of contractors from the region and from abroad. This building is one of many that were delivered by Eastern Europeans in the United Arab Emirates and in Kuwait during the final decade of the Cold War, again, always in collaboration with local actors, both public and private. These buildings testify to an increasingly aggressive attempt by state socialist companies to enter foreign markets, again, in the view of the debt crisis and the need to earn convertible currencies. In so doing, managers of these companies left out references to socialist internationalism and presented themselves as carriers of technological expertise on par with their Western competitors. This expertise was the condition of their integration into the Western-dominated market of design and construction services in the Gulf. As I argue, they had acquired this expertise during their previous engagements in the Middle East and in North Africa. And these previous engagements since the late 1950s took place in the networks of socialist internationalists. It was then that these companies and individuals learned to comply with Western building norms and specification standards, financial regimes, technological systems. But this learning process also including modern construction technologies, and by the 1980s, computer-aided design software. But it was also a lesson in aesthetic proclivities of governmental clients in Arab countries. As you know, the Gulf is often seen as a paradigmatic place, or one of the paradigmatic places for architecture's globalization at the turn of the 21st century. Accordingly, by focusing on the Gulf, this book inscribes socialist internationalism into a more complex and more antagonistic genealogy of architecture's globalization. And I will end here. Thank you.
Hello? Okay. Our next speaker is Philipp Oswalt. I'm very happy to introduce you, Philipp, because we collaborated together on this book, and I'm very happy with this collaboration. Thank you, Philipp. Philipp's talk will be the impact of Mediterranean architecture on the formation of the European avant-garde. Philipp Oswalt has been professor of architectural theory and design at the University of Kassel since 2006. From 1988 to 1994, he was editor of the architecture magazine Arc Plus and worked for OMA Rempulhas in 1996-1997. He was the initiator and co-director of the European research project Urban Catalyst in 2001-2003. He acted as co-initiator and co-curator of the interim cultural use of the Palace der Republik and was director of the project Shrinking Cities of the Federal Cultural Foundation 2002-2008. From 2009 to 2014, Philipp served as director of the Bauhaus-Dessau Foundation and was co-initiator of Project Bauhaus. The initiative Zukunft Bühnen in Frankfurt and the Critical Learning Place, Garnison Kirche Potsdam 2020. The floor is yours, Philipp.
George, thanks a lot. Yeah, as we discussed how to have certain themes in this context, it was for us very important to discuss the subject of transculturality and to deconstruct the myth of a kind of modernism as a European concept disseminated in globally as a too primitive kind of narrative. And so we have already now found, got presented several modes of different interactions. And for me, it's very important also to understand that this myth of this kind of origin of the classical avant-garde in Europe is kind of very problematic, as it is itself kind of founded very much on transcultural processes itself. What is very known is that there is an impact of the American vernacular, and there is an impact of Japanese architecture. And kind of working on the question of the Bauhaus brand, I was also curious to understand where the Bauhaus style is coming from. And there are, of course, very different sources. So there's not a single cause how it originated, but there is quite a significant reflection on Mediterranean architecture. And this is what I just wanted to point out very bold. So already in the kind of, already in the time of Enlightenment in the late 18th century, there was, of course, this new excursion and research trips to the Arab world. Here, Carsten Niebuhr, and commissioned by the Danish king in Yemen. And next one. And then already Schinkel, who is also in the kind of pre-formation of kind of modernist style, so to say. If you look at the pavilion he built in the Charlottenburg at the castle, which is kind of very cubic, almost white, and is kind of like an early sign of this development of such a style. He kind of was also reflecting on the kind of Mediterranean architecture in Capri, where he was 20 years before, as you can see in the sketch to the left. And Tony Garnier, when he was developing his concept of the industrial city, which has an enormous impact on Le Corbusier, was having a grant as Prix de Rome in working on the reconstruction of the Acropolis of Tusculum, which you see to the left. In this formation of the Bauhaus style, actually the Viennese architect played a major role because it was already before the World War I. And so Josef Hoffmann doing the sanatorium in 1904, which is already kind of the formation of this kind of style of wide buildings with flat roofs. He was a few years before also in Capri, like Schinkel, doing these sketches. And more significantly is, of course, Adolf Loos, who has a kind of major impact in this development. And he was not only in the Greek islands. In 1904, he was visiting Skyros, but he was also traveling to Morocco, to Algeria, to the Balkan, and to Turkey. And it is obvious that kind of there is, in the search for a new style, which is kind of breaking the classical tradition in the Western architecture, there is a reference to these kind of other cultural influences. It's very known in the modern art and the impact of kind of, for example, African art on the development of abstract and modernist art. But in architecture, I think it's completely undervalued. And Le Corbusier actually was then later on kind of taking the inspiration of Loos. He was in 1911, he was for a half year in Vienna and took then this trip to the Orient, his well-known trip to the Orient. And it's also interesting that Out, who was also kind of a very early one, 1916, building the Villa Allegionda in the Netherlands, which was actually a refurbishment of an existing building. And he has, I mean, he didn't travel to the Arabic region, but he has had the commission to build a Moorish room, in German, Maurischen Raum. And so he obviously kind of took this desire by the client further in how he did these, he developed the architecture as such. And he was also one, like the Viennese architect, who was pushing this kind of new articulation and new vocabulary of architecture early on. So the point is that kind of, if we now see kind of the kind of resonance of European education and architecture references in the Arab world, to some aspect, it's kind of bringing certain ideas back where they have been coming from. Thank you.
And now we move on to the last presentation for this session, and we will welcome any comments and questions for the whole session after that. So allow me to introduce Panayota Pilla, who is an architectural historian and theorist with a PhD from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. She's a professor at the Department of Architecture of the University of Cyprus, having previously served on the faculty of the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Her writings examine the intersections of architecture with the history and geopolitics of development, modernism, and environmentalism. And she will talk about the crossovers of developmentalism in the work of Doxiadis. Please go ahead.
Great, many thanks. And I want to thank George and Philip as well, and congratulate you on the work you have done. And I'm looking forward to reading the book. And thank you for the invitation. And it's great to be sort of to be asked to do this, because it helped me go back to work I had done a while ago and rethink it in new light. So thank you for that as well. The conference topic and the invitation made me ponder this question: what exactly would be the purpose of trying to highlight the cultural crossovers in the enterprise of Doxiadis? What exactly would be the purpose? I had three answers to this that helped me capture what I will present in the next few minutes. And meanwhile, I will also reflect on what this tells us about two key concepts that have been central to the shaping of the modern Middle East: development and tradition. Let me start then. One purpose of considering these crossovers is to indeed unveil the historical complexity and the intricacies of the exchanges in the global practice of Doxiadis, which spanned 4 continents. For example, when he went to Baghdad in 1955, he went there upon the recommendation of American development experts and World Bank friends he had made earlier through his work on the Marshall Plan in Greece. Up to the point when he went to Baghdad, he was a planner from Greece, and the Iraq Development Board was his first international client. The office he established in Baghdad was an office that was only quasi-Western, let's say, because it was composed of mostly Greek professionals who had previously operated on the receiving end of development aid to Greece. And plus Doxiadis Associates, the Doxiadis Associates office in Baghdad also hired other nationals, most notably Hassan Fatih, as part of the team. So even from the simple data on the geographical and cultural backgrounds of the actors, we can begin to see that Doxiadis' operation in Iraq was not a straightforward matter of someone exporting modernity and some local importing. Doxiadis was certainly aspiring to rationalize housing in Iraq. He wanted to get rid of the sarifas and all sorts of mud brick structures, to use modern materials and new design methods. In the name of efficiency and standardization, he proposed a system of communities of various scales, making all sorts of economic and sociological analysis of how many houses should go to a neighborhood, etc. Meanwhile, he was also traveling around, taking photos of the locale and keeping very detailed itineraries, diaries. Similarly, Hassan Fatih brought with him the knowledge, his own knowledge of his 1940s experiments with mud brick that he had done in Egypt. And he tried various things while he was working at Doxiadis Associates. Sorry, okay, we are at the right slide now. He tried various things while he was working at Doxiadis Associates. He also studied local, he did the trips that Doxiadis was doing, but his focus was on local courtyard houses. He studied wind catchers he encountered, and following modes of Doxiadis Associates scientific analysis, sometimes he tried to explain, for example, the mechanics of the Baghdad with so as to be able to converse with the rest of the Doxiadis Associates office. Some of the work, some of the studies he made it into the publications of Doxiadis Associates. For example, his proposal for housing in Musayib made it into the Acoustics Journal as building types with a certain, as building types, and they were systematized and standardized within the overall plan of the town. In other words, Doxiadis Associates office was filtering Fatih's ideas in terms of his own agendas for standardization, its own priorities for efficiency, and its own aesthetics. Conversely, Fatih too was trying to follow in the steps of the firm he was in, making various studies of high-rise housing, sometimes trying to see how a courtyard would work in 3D, in height, something that others, of course, had tried elsewhere as well. Fatih even proposed to combine geodesic domes into the design of houses, which is something that was probably an influence from Buckminster Fuller, who was also part of Doxiadis's global network and part of the City of the Future project, in which both Fatih and Fuller were involved. And when Fatih suggested the Gossip Square, a square that would be inserted among every so many houses as a place for neighbors to gather, the Doxiadis Associates office happily embraced it, as it provided another way to temper the rationalized methodology of housing and appear to be more in touch with the local culture. Now, the Gossip Square was an odd addition to a master plan that emphasized spatial ordering and abstractions like hierarchies of communities, income groups, and house types. But the firm embraced it and advertised it as proof that Doxiadis Associates is not a group of hard-nosed Western experts, hard-nosed Western experts. For similar reasons, they embraced the idea of courtyard houses, although in an incredibly abstracted way, to the point where they are not recognizable. And they did use the term courtyards in many other places around the world, all the way to Philadelphia. Now, the issue I want to raise here is not how precisely Doxiadis associates took influences such as those of Fatih or Fuller, because they did not. Nor is the issue who influenced whom. Was Doxiadis' use of the term courtyard really coming from Fatih, or did he learn it already from his studies in rural Greece? Perhaps a historian may want to dive into the archives even more and figure out the lineage of these influences. But what I'm arguing here is something else. These influences are multi-directional, and they find expression in the work of these architects in many ways, even in the long term. To come back to the specific example, one may not recognize, let me speak to this. One may not recognize much of Fatih in these houses of Baghdad, but in a resort housing project in Greece, more than a decade later, Doxiadis would begin to echo Hasan Fatih when he spoke of the spirituality of spaces and when he discussed culture in terms of sensory experiences. Similarly, on the other end, Fatih's attempts to converse with global visions and rationalized methodologies may not be readily visible in the architecture of his later buildings. But probably Fatih's trajectory would not have been the same if he hadn't spent those 4 years at Doxiadis Associates. Working in Baghdad may have something to do with how he shifted from seeing his mud brick housing experiments as a search for Egyptian identity to describing them as an expression of Arab or even Islamic traditions. Also, the experience with Doxiadis Associates may have to do with his venturing into New Mexico towards the end of his life. The work at Doxiadis Associates expanded not only his geographical outreach, but also his consciousness about the larger relevance of his experiments with appropriate technologies, interdisciplinarity, even his ideas of environmental balance were sort of honed during the DA time. So indeed, if one were to look at into the debates of the two men and the complex geographies and overlapping cultural preconceptions of the Doxiadis Associates office, this can certainly help us challenge power relationships in architectural historiography and even act as correctives to sort of Eurocentric conceptions. But there's a second value in highlighting cultural crossovers, and I will stick to using the same example. The Iraqi gossip squares were initially framed as places for women to gather. This was a stereotype that was at the beginning as embraced with no concern for a while. Then, however, Doxiadis began to mention that, okay, these squares are for all families, men and women, etc. And then very soon later, he rejected the term entirely and forbade the use of the term with a memo to the entire office around the world. Did he grow to appreciate Iraq and Iraqis more? And he decided to abolish the term. Did he become sensitized to the complexities of Iraqi culture? Did he just become more mindful of paternalism? We may not know yet exactly the syllogism, but what I'm trying to say here is that this more detailed study of influences and crossovers allows us precisely to interrogate these other types of power relationships that have to do with race and gender. Doxiadis was also imagining how to teach local laborers in the new construction methods. So these two needs to be scrutinized. And Fadi's idea of the collaboration with local workers and the trinity of the architect and user and work and craftsman, these also need to be scrutinized in these terms of that don't have to do with that have to do with issues of race, gender, and labor. So to summarize this point, the historiographic study of cultural crossovers is not about correcting or balancing power relationships, but it is about exposing a whole different set of power relationships that also deserve scrutiny. This brings me to the final point that relates to what I just said. There are certain modes of thinking, certain modes of operation that get fueled, strengthened, even perpetuated through these crossovers. And from the story I'm sketching here about Doxiadis, Baghdad, gossip squares, and a bit of Hassan Fati, I want to highlight two threads. One has to do with the advancement of development and its progressive assumptions. Whether it was called social reform, as Fati was imagining it in the 1940s Egypt, or as Iraq Development Board was imagining it in the late 50s, or whether it was called modernization and development, which is the terms that Doxiadis and development institutions used, these ideas advanced a rationalist, bureaucratic, and developmental ethos that basically shaped the modern Middle East. In fact, I would say that development is something that permeates both 40s and post-40s ways of thinking and connected to processes of globalization. The important thing, therefore, as we look at these crossovers, is also to recognize how development and the prioritization of its economics became a sort of entrenched interest that one can see even in those approaches that claim to be critical of modernism. Those attempts by Doxiadis to temper rationalism and humanize modernism by some attention to tradition, some attention to appropriate technology, to local societies, may have also formed the beginnings of what we see today in terms of an enframing and commodification of traditions. And in terms of the prioritization of market economics in architecture, again, it's something, those modes were bringing this kind of emphasis on the way we see today, the enframing or the staging of traditions into mass tourism processes, for example, is again pointing to certain continuities in the development thinking that have persevered through time. With this, I end. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. And actually, I would like to start the comments and questions section by asking Dr. Stanek of the impact of Polish and the architects of Eastern Bloc on, let's say, the educational realm in Iraq. If any of any specific names emerged as educators in Iraq, if they, for example, spent more time to develop work on developing a more localized version of architecture.
Yes, thank you very much. This is indeed a really quite an important topic, and I only managed to briefly touch upon it in my book. But you're absolutely right. This was a really quite an important aspect of these exchanges, and that included in particular the work of several architects from Czechoslovakia at that time and Poland at the Baghdad School of Architecture. And these engagements, and that's quite relevant to understand the dynamics of the process more generally. These engagements quite often started by initial invitations of people who were already then in Baghdad working, for instance, on the master plan or on other projects employed by various ministries, municipalities. And then, gradually some of these architects who were practicing architects stepped into the role of educators. And again, here perhaps the most relevant name is the name of the Czech architects Václav Bašta, and also his wife, in reference to a really important question, which I think here is in the Q&A box about the role of women architects. So Miroslava Baštova, the wife of Václav Bašta, had also an important role in educating young Iraqi architects. And they worked closely with a number of important Iraqi architects and educators, Mohamed Makia perhaps being the first among them, but also with others coming from other places. In terms of the specific profile of their work, I'm not sure if one could summarize it, because there were so many people and people who taught not only in Baghdad but also at other then newly established universities in Iraq. But I think that it's fair to say that a certain attention to context, a certain if you like, Central European understanding of a continuum between architecture and urban scales, which I think has characterized Central European education for quite some time. These were, broadly speaking, and perhaps slightly abstractly speaking, the features of this pedagogy. I should also mention, and I think that's quite interesting, that that in other countries in the region, in particular in Algeria, but also in Libya, there were educators from various socialist countries. For instance, I have interviewed a number of Romanian architects who were teaching in Algeria, and here, the fact that Romanian culture had been for a long time francophone kind of helped to establish these links. The same was the case with Syria.
Before we take some questions from the audience, we have two questions or comments in the chat. One of them is asking about the publication in English. Actually, this publication is in English and Arabic. It has both languages. That was deliberate. We'll speak more about this tomorrow. And the second question, and the question is also about whether there are a lot of publications in Arabic on modern architecture. Well, some have already been published, and there is much research happening. I've noticed that many students are doing now PhDs and masters research on the Arab world and 20th century mostly. So that's the good news. And there's a question, of course, that came up also about the absence of women, or at least what was the role of women. And this also we will discuss tomorrow in the book, because of course everybody knows that for a long time, at least in the Arab world, women were not studying architecture. There were only a few, and it's only in the 60s and 70s that we start seeing more women in education. Things are changing a lot, of course. Nowadays, there are more women than men in many architecture schools in the Arab world, and this will be discussed a bit tomorrow. And I had this thing I wanted to say before we open to the public, which is this interesting idea of the aller-retour of influences. And so it's not one way. So we had, for example, also in the case of Sayyid Karim, we have an architect spreading his work all over. We have a city that was a sort of fusion of all sorts of expertises, local and international. We have the idea of the East Bloc influence that is not known. And thank you very much, Łukasz, for all the research you've done and the publications, because we usually look at more at Western influences, and this is great. We also have the boomerang effect, the aller-retour of influence from here and there. And what Panayota mentioned very well, which is how can we scrutinize the intentions? So when the style is there, this idea of stylistic reference, but what comes with it? What are the intentions behind providing these spaces in terms of equality, democracy? Is it really what is needed in a particular time? Interestingly enough, the work of Fathi is also discussed in the book. We will speak about this in one of the sessions with Layla Al-Wakil, because it's rediscovered nowadays also, of course, because of today's concern with sustainable design, with self-building and so on. So there as well, we have to scrutinize a little bit what is going on in there. Are there any questions in the audience we would like to make of this conversation? And maybe somebody wants to comment.
I would have two questions. One to Mohamed about the publication of Karim, because maybe, I mean, you focused in your presentation his architectural work, but I would be interested if you could say a few more words about how he created a space of discourse with these publications. Have they been kind of discussed and bought and distributed to other Arab countries? And what was the impact of that? What was popping up in these magazines? Was this from different countries, which countries, and so on? I think that would be interesting to understand this kind of transcultural space he created with publications. And to Panayota, I was really impressed in the way you presented also how Doxiadis managed to create such a fluid space intellectually, where he kind of bypassed a lot of ideologies which has been established in the different parts of the world, and somehow brought things together. It was not clear to me that Hassan Fathy and Buckminster Fuller met in his work for Baghdad. So maybe you can extend a bit more on how he was able to create such a space, which is, I think, really impressive.
So the magazine did have regional distribution. At least there was an aspiration for that. It has you can see that the information in the back asks people who are interested to contact the office for distribution to their cities. However, I haven't had access to numbers in terms of how many copies were sent across the region, but that was possible. In terms of content, very little content was sourced from elsewhere in the region. So there's a clear kind of focal point from which knowledge is meant to be distributed within his sort of conception. What else can I say on this? The other magazines that he wrote in were mostly geared at the Egyptian public, were not regionally distributed. And I think it's important to note here also that Al-Imara it's basically a self-funded project, which, I mean, as someone who tried to establish some sort of discursive space in the format of a zine, money is an issue. So I'm not really sure how his father did have some wealth, and his father paid for much of the run of the magazine, which ran from 39 to 59. And then his wife actually was the patron of the magazine. I mean, if we want to talk about also the role of women, there are other ways in which women were involved, not only as clients, but in this case, for example, funding a magazine on architecture, probably the only one at the time. So yeah, regional distribution was an option, content very little from elsewhere, numbers unknown. Most of the magazine is digitized and is available online, so people should continue to look at it. I don't think the story is done. I think there's a lot more work to be done.
Great. Shall I continue? Okay. Thanks for your question, Philipp. And I will highlight two characteristics of Doxiadis that allowed him to be called actually a great synthesizer, and that really allowed him to sleep between East and West, socialism and capitalism, and slide between being a recipient of development and being an actor in development. One reason his enterprise and his own persona, one reason that his enterprise was situated in this sort of fluid way was his very own persona and the way he presented himself as someone who is free of the imperialist stigma. His Greek nationality allowed him to appear not Westerner enough, but Westerner enough to sort of convince governments of some of the things they were looking for without carrying the stigma of the colonial power. One is this, and the other is what you already hinted at, the apolitical rhetoric that he was able to advance, which was mainly premised on the claims to scientific neutrality and comprehensiveness. All the analysis and all the scientism were able for a while, and even the claims to synthesis of sciences, synthesis of disciplines and comprehensiveness were allowing the firm and himself to sort of support an argument of being apolitical. And he would often actually claim that even though his funding was often from the Ford Foundation, for example, more than the United Nations, he would claim that he's neither on the socialist nor on the sort of Western side, and that what the goal is the better environment and not a political gain. And he was basing it on the things that I mentioned before. Now, some of the work was also sort of proving certain differences from other examples. The project in Baghdad, and even later the project, the planning of Islamabad, could indeed stand out as different from, let's say, the master planning of Brasilia or Chandigarh. There were certain sort of design qualities that could allow him to support these larger claims, which, however, were much larger than the sort of the facts on the ground, perhaps.
Thank you, Pani. Any reactions from the audience? Comments? Sara? Mohamed?
Just a question.
There's a microphone.
Was there any comparative? Thank you very much. So, Mohamed, was there any comparative work or study about Fathis and Karim at the same time? How they related both to the nation-state discourse and so on?
I think this is a big question, Mark, that everybody that's worked on this period in Egypt has been wondering, because there seems to have been either they ignored each other or there was unspoken animosity. I'm not quite sure, but I did find in the Karim archives an invitation to a Sayyid Karim, in Sayyid Karim's archive, I found an invitation to a Hassan Fathi event, I think after he got some award, and it was basically unopened, so I don't think he went. So maybe that's an indication of how they felt about each other. There are no studies. I think While on the surface of it, it appears that they are quite different. I do think the two architects had maybe not similarities, certainly not in terms of aesthetics, but I think they were both very ambitious and very self-centered. And those qualities don't necessarily make those types of people friends. So I don't think there is much collaboration, and it doesn't seem like they have politically conflicting projects, but certainly in terms of their approach to architecture and materiality, they were on the opposite ends of the spectrum. Yeah.
Actually, both were considered to collaborate with, I guess, the policy or the state in a way. Both work for the agenda in a controversially maybe way.
That might be an overstatement. I think both wanted, again, the question of, I mean, the trouble with the profession of architecture is that you need a client and you need a big one, or at least one with big resources is what I mean. And I think both of them, to build an entire village in one case, to build an entire city in another, you need a state, especially in the very tumultuous political context that they're both working in. I mean, 45 was not a pleasant year to start an experimental village in rural Egypt. The country was basically an uprising as soon as the war ended for 6 years, nonstop protests, a lot of political scandal, and then this relatively young architect at the time wants to build an experimental village in the underdeveloped South. That's not much of a context for these ideas to really fully materialize. And I think this is why partly, for example, the Fathi's case, the village was kind of, undermined, I would say, for a couple of decades. It was only appreciated much later. And same with say Karim. Say Karim recognized the necessity for the state to enter the scene as a client. And he politically, actually, just as to what we were talking about, East Bloc versus the West. Well, say Karim's politics were very interesting. I don't think he was very clearly anti-imperialist in a lot of his bits and pieces that one can collect. But maybe this is me projecting on him my own views as well. It's hard to tell. Because there isn't like a clear manifesto, but it's very clear that politically within Egypt, he was willing to work for a king or a president, a military person or a civilian. I don't think that was the issue for him as long as it was a client. And we see this with a lot of architects practicing this time as well. So it seems the relationship, I would say, with the state is very shaky. It's not a clear one. Yeah, in both cases, I would say.
If I may say, can I say something here? Because I find it interesting. I find the question very interesting, and I wonder also. I mean, it may be again one of those themes that come from the profession of architecture at the time at large. The alignment of architecture and technocracy, whether it's the state or something else, and the idea that this is necessary for the architecture to operate. This seems to be sort of just like the idea of development. The idea of technocracy is something that may be one of these common threads between the two. That's all.
On the same question, we will see tomorrow also in one of the presentations. The Mahmoud Riyad is also a third actor, if you want, of this this moment with 3 very different directions, and this is what we wanted to also have in the book, and we'll speak about it.
If there's no other questions, I would like to ask our moderator a question, or maybe Mohamed. The two of you, I mean, there is also the question of transculturality within the region. Yeah, I mean, we speak about our architecture in the Arabic world. Yeah, but I mean, it's a common language, but there are enormous cultural differences. On the other hand, in the post-war period, there is the idea of Pan-Arabism. So the question is, I mean, what is the cultural interaction in between? I mean, you explained it when we developed the project a lot to me, which I didn't have much knowledge. But I think, I mean, I think people who have a deep knowledge about the region, and we will have also part of the audience which has not such a deep. Maybe you can say a bit about this idea of Pan-Arabism and what it meant for the cultural exchange within the region.
Yeah, I could say a few words. At the time, the Arab world was very open to Arabs, which is not the case now, at least for privilege.
I hope so.
Yeah,
I hope the Arab world is open to Arabs.
It's very different.
Yes.
So you had a lot of architects, engineers going to a city to study, whether it's Baghdad or Beirut, the American University, Université Saint-Joseph, and later other universities, and then going back to wherever they came from or going to another place where their career would be prosperous. And indeed it was. So a lot of Sara with her colleagues wrote about Kuwait. You see a lot of these people going through these universities and then you have a lot of Palestinians also who had to leave and find their career somewhere else. You see them in Egypt, you see them in Syria, with great work that is not quite known also. We've been trying, and I will have a presentation about this in the next session, to gather as much information as possible, at least basic information threads, so that people can do more research on those. So yes, now for the idea of Pan-Arabism, and it shows also in the different texts we have in the book, it almost didn't mean the same thing to everybody. So we see that in the case of Kuwait, for example, this idea of Pan-Arabism was there for the museum, but it had also to be very Kuwaiti because of the strengths of the neighbors. So it had to do with defining what is Kuwait, in what Kuwait could be different from the strong and powerful neighbors.
Sorry. Yes. Yes, because we are talking about a country that was not yet a country, trying to find their roots to be recognized as one. And the Pan-Arabism movement on those times was helping even those countries, and even especially Kuwait, to find its identity. And when it received so many influence from the Levant, from Egypt and Iraq, it helped to build that notion and that translocal and Pan-Arabism feeling that was happening on the region.
So I think one thing I thought about when I was preparing for this is when we talked about Pan-Arabism, there's kind of an acceptance already of a post-Sykes-Picot Middle East, because just shortly, I mean, Said Karim was born in 1911, Hassan Fathy was born in 1900, you know, they spent at least the early childhood, at least times of their lives in a context in which, well, the borders are open. There are no borders practically in many ways. You know, one of the great ironies of the myth, I think, of decolonizing / independence of the 1950s is that with independence came closed borders for the first time. For the first time, Egyptians, on the one hand, they were told, now you're independent, but on the other hand, for the first time, they were told, you can't leave these borders. I'm not really sure that that's, you know, in practice, that has how you promote, in reality, Pan-Arabism. But discourse, there's a lot of talk by leaders on the concept of Pan-Arabism. But, you know, people who were able to move around couldn't.
You are not allowed to enter the neighboring countries. You have been not allowed to enter the neighboring countries, or what was the issue with closed borders?
Well, if we recast the post-World War II move, what we've sort of believed for decades, we being just the global public, I guess, paying attention to what was going on, what we believed as independence movements in many ways translated into colonialism 2.0 with the leadership of military leadership or other kinds of oligarchies. And so if we think of it this way, then closing borders in order to manage populations, well, that makes sense from a colonial perspective. I'm not really sure how practically the whole world bought into the narrative of independence for like 6-7 decades. Only now we're starting to kind of reopen that file and think, well, was it really what we thought it was? And this becomes clear in the case of, say, Karim, because, you know, the odd, you know, conflict of having an architect with a lot of ambition, with a lot of commissions within the state, who then has the state put him under house arrest and then give projects to, you know, everybody else, practically, including, you know, a refurbished, you know, former Nazi architect to do the main stadium of the new regime. That's a little strange. Doesn't sound like much independence to me. And therefore, where's the actual practice of Pan-Arabism going to come in that political context? And I think this is part of one of the main issues that I've always encountered with how we talk about architecture in general, but specifically in the Arab world, especially when we sort of copy paste the curriculum perspective of let's look at styles and buildings, is that political context is kind of pushed to the footnotes. Well, I think it's really important to bring it to the introduction. You know, it's really forefront, because that's how I can understand the transformations of a career, let's say Karim's, and how it ends and how it flourished at some points and so on. So this is why I'm also very, you know, uneasy about the concept of Pan-Arabism, because it accepts a narrative that was pushed from the top down in ways that were very antagonistic to what was already in practice from the bottom up, which is the fact that, you know, when you looked at architects practicing in Egypt in the early 20th century, there are Syrians and Lebanese and Jews and coming from all over the region. Well, a lot of those either went to immigrate in Canada, died early, or had their archives stolen, or, well, it doesn't sound like independence to me. It doesn't sound like Pan-Arabism to me in practice. So that's why I would put a big question mark on it.
Okay, and now if you allow me, Łukasz, you had a comment?
Well, I still thought it's quite relevant to come back to Asma's question about women, which I'm sure I know that George promised that you will be discussing them tomorrow, but I think it's probably not too much to discuss it twice. So I think that was one of the really, I think, interesting topics that I have been encountering while working on this research, and because you could really see that this question resulted from a sort of intersection of the shifting positions of professional women, on the one hand in Eastern Europe, in this kind of rapidly transforming countries, which after World War II became socialist, and on the other hand, or in the Soviet Union earlier, because of the Soviet Union earlier, and on the other hand, in a kind of equally dynamic and sometimes violent moment in the Middle East, where you know, women emancipation was quite often proclaimed, but not always realized by some of the socialist-leaning regimes, and so. You could see that on the one hand, there is an official discourse, certainly in the socialist countries, on promotion of women and education of women, and in many ways, a very efficient one, and one which really resulted in very high numbers of Eastern European women entering the architectural profession, certainly higher at that time than, for example, in Western Europe. But on the other hand, the fact that there's relatively large numbers of professional women, that did not necessarily mean that these women achieved you know, significant leadership positions, since entrenched views on gendered roles were certainly not disposed of. Nevertheless, there's a number of people who contributed in significant ways and to architecture and planning and construction in the Middle East and in North Africa, professional women coming from socialist countries. And I just wanted to mention a few names just to be more precise. For example, I'm thinking about the Hungarian architect Ildikó Halmagyi, who you know, worked extensively in Algeria on housing projects and in medical projects. There is the East German architect Gertrud Schiller, who worked for Carl Zeiss, and she was the head designer of for instance, the planetarium in Tripoli. There was a number of women in leadership positions in Yugoslav design companies. And for example, I'm thinking about Liliana Bakic, who worked with her husband in Kuwait and designed significant buildings, but also a number of high-profile housing projects. I'm thinking about Stanka Lozanova-Dundachova from Bulgaria, who worked in the Gulf, but also in North Africa. And I'm also thinking of the Polish architect Danuta Mieszkowska, who worked in Baghdad. And she was at one point the head of the Polish team in Baghdad, of the field office in Baghdad, and working on a major commission called the General Housing Program for Iraq. And so I think that, again, the trajectories of each of them were very, very different. And the differences resulted in kind of specific intersections of race, class, and gender. Sometimes some of these people, thought about themselves as bringing socialist ideas to the Middle East, to North Africa. Some of them clearly kind of try to tap into that tradition of a white colonial woman and the privileges that this position entail. And so I think this is a very complex story, and I think one perhaps worth exploring more.
Just thinking about the role of diplomacy here in practice, in terms of this question of architects having access to different fields, in many cases ones that they've never stepped foot in order to gain projects, and how this was facilitated by diplomats representing various countries of power. And just so that we're not talking about all of this, I think, as a sort of a historical event that's in the past, this is ongoing as we speak, probably in, amplified in unimaginable scales as we speak right now. I mean, a lot of what the embassies in the region end up doing is bring in and push their consultants to get really big government contracts. I remember, after 2011, I still insist to call it revolution, just because that's what it felt like on the street. When that happened, the Goethe-Institut in Cairo hosted an event on the future of Cairo. And I went as an audience member, and I had no idea who was speaking, but who had they invited to speak about the future of Cairo? Take a wild guess. Albert Speer Jr., who has massive contracts all around the Middle East. I mean, listen, I'm not saying, we all carry our father's burdens, but there's plenty of other options to invite to speak about the future of Cairo when there's a revolution happening. And what did Albert Speer Jr. have to propose? That we need to buy Siemens wind turbines from Germany. That was his idea of the future. So clearly the relationship between architects and diplomacy and these various avenues that are opened up in this way is an ongoing systemic condition. So I think a lot of these case studies that we're looking at from this period really have a lot of resonance today that we should consider as well. American companies in the Gulf, for example, and all of that, yeah.
Hello. Amin Assadan here. Thank you, everyone, for your contributions. I cannot help but make the comment to our participants joining via Zoom. I'm really struck by the absencing and I would say the erasure of Iraqi architects, because both speakers spoke about so-called influence in Iraq. The episode that Panyota was talking about specifically, wondering where the courtyard came from, whether it's from Egypt or Cyprus. I'm like, the guy spent enough time in Iraq doing research, and we actually have evidence that he relied on Iraqi artists and architects for the research he was doing, and they were his guides, and they actually shared with him many of the ideas that he ended up implementing, including not only the courtyards, but also the patterns that you see in the buildings in what became known as Thawra City, or now Sadr City, but also specifically the use of turquoise colored tiles that didn't come from Egypt or Cyprus, right? You also spoke about Fathi's time in the office of Doxiadis. And again, as though that was kind of the determining factor in the Iraq projects. And you forget to mention the presence of Qahtan al-Madfa'i, who's a prominent Iraqi architect who also spent at least a year in that office in 1957, where he met and married his Greek wife, right? So some examples to share. I realize maybe that we don't have access to those sources, but I would just invite and encourage a little bit more humility, you know, that there might be other sides to this story that we're not aware of. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. I am sorry if anything sounded not humble. So I'll say that for starters, because I wouldn't want anything I wouldn't want anything I say to be taken as such. Cyprus I didn't mention. I had mentioned rural Greece, which was something Doxiadis had studied. And I mentioned, I showed, the drawings I showed of Fatih were from Iraq, not from Egypt. Now, he had in the 40s, however, done a lot of studies of courtyard houses as well as other sort of types of architecture in Egypt. And I mentioned his larger sort of career path, just to make my point that one has to look at this larger career path. It's true, I did not research, I did not have any more access to any diaries of his work in Egypt or in Cairo. Excuse me, yeah, I don't have the diaries of Cairo and I don't have the diaries of Iraq, except a few, which is, I showed snapshots of that. But I don't think I meant to say that the design of in Baghdad was based on ideas from Greece and Egypt. I just mentioned, I was trying to sort of show those snippets of the archives that I had studied to make a larger theoretical argument. I'm not even claiming that I'm the expert on the Doxiadis project in Baghdad and all the influences he absorbed. I was trying to make the larger theoretical argument of how crossovers allow us to make a more complex historiographic analysis, which is not yet complete, obviously. Nor do I speak Arabic, nor do I speak Arabic. And you know, I always had this problem whenever I was. I spent a year in Cairo doing some research on Hassan Fatih many years ago, and there was always the question. But you don't speak Arabic. I only spoke emergency Arabic. It is a very big, important handicap. And one cannot say that I can understand Hassan Fatih without speaking Arabic. One can say that it's a very big handicap. At the same time, it sounds to me it would be a little essentialist to say that one cannot discuss Hassan Fatih even at the extent one can understand from the perspective one brings. One might be able to say a couple of things. They don't claim to, what I said about either Doxiadis or Fatih is not claiming to providing a full story on either one of them.
If I can, may I add to this?
Yes, please. We also have a question for you in the question and answer section.
Okay, so I'm not sure if Amin meant me too, because I don't think you mentioned specific comments about my presentation, and I mentioned, for instance, to be specific, Kahtanaouni and Mohamed Makia in what I said, but I think that I will use this opportunity to actually comment on Mohamed's really important points on diplomacy, because I think that the work that I have been doing kind of shows perhaps the questions of diplomacy in a nuance, with some nuance. So on the one hand, it is absolutely true that, for instance, questions of credits, low cost credits, and questions of the so-called technical aid or technical assistance were really important kind of avenues for architects from socialist countries, perhaps most importantly from the Soviet Union, to enter the Middle East at that time, at a specific period, and so you are absolutely right to point that out. And that, I'm now in Ghana, and the questions of precisely those two issues, so credits and development aid, are very much still present in the construction industry and in architecture, and heatedly debated and controversially debated. But there were also other avenues where I think the story is more nuanced, including the United Nations, where evidently representatives of the United Nations would need to have the support of the governments, but nevertheless, quite often, these people, for example, Adolf Ciborowski, who had really important impact, had really important role in kind of facilitating some of the early contacts between Polish urbanists and Iraqi ministries and decision makers. Ciborowski was traveling within the networks of the United Nations. The other really important kind of avenue was scholarships, where a number of Iraqi and other people from other countries were awarded scholarships in Eastern Europe, in the Soviet Union, and kind of like coming back, the contacts which they started during their studies resulted in very specific invitations, sometimes going very much against the official lines of the socialist governments, and that included invitations to countries which had very, very little to do with socialism, for instance the United Arab Emirates. And to wrap it up, one of the, I think, important and key arguments that I'm trying to make in my book is that very, very often Eastern Europeans were what I wanted to call weak actors. In other words, they were under pressure of the governments. They rarely understood themselves as actors spreading socialism. They were rather needed to answer to a number of requirements by the governments back home, and the ability to answer to these requirements relied on, if you like, the satisfaction of the clients and the counterparts in the Arab countries. And that produced a very particular type of the dynamics, which I think in many ways were different to the dynamics of the collaboration between, let's say, Western European actors in the Middle East at the time. And so that weakness is, if you like, was paradoxical, because they were so accommodating in many times to the requirements of the public and private clients in the Middle East, that they became very, very instrumental, not in pursuing their own goals or even the goals of the Eastern European governments, but rather local decision makers.
And if you allow me, there is a question from Sharb al-Abshara. What was Saddam Hussein's reason to work with specifically Polish architects to design the Baghdad master plan? Why didn't he work with other architects with similar political background? And this is to Łukasz.
Yes, just very, very briefly to clarify, it was not Saddam Hussein who invited these architects. These were the governments from Qasim to the Ba'ath Party, which in an earlier period that invited or decided about the one tender for the master plan. Actually, during the late 1970s, in the 1980s, Polish architects became less and less present in Baghdad, and for instance, in many ways, the more visible actors. Speaking about socialist countries or kind of socialist countries were Yugoslavs. It was the firm Energo Project, which delivered a number of designs, and that related to, if you like, the newfound and new claimed role of Iraq within the non-aligned movement.
Yeah, thank you. I would like to have a small comment about the issue raised by Amin, which is the issue of, I mean, he said humility. I think that this is a word that is too strong for what is happening here in this research and in this conversation. Of course, there is more need of information. And we often read two papers about the same issue. And by the mere fact that they are relying on very different sources, even the actors and the role of people involved in a building become very different from one paper to the other, or from one research to the other. And the case of Al-Mustansiriya itself that you wrote about in the book is a case. Łukasz, for example, has more information or different information about the roles of different actors in the production of the building. And therefore, I think that what needs to be done and is done in this book and in other research is to lay things out, allow access to information, organize information, and then interpret the facts rather than have an ideological position claiming authorship for an architect, a country, a tradition, and so on. This is why I think this idea of transculturality is precisely the place of accepting the idea that things are not black and white, that there are influences that are clear, others that are not. And we want to debunk all of this and unpack it. So thank you. Do we take another?
Panayota,
okay. Can I just add one note that may not have been clear, because as far as the formal analysis, one of the reasons I chose to tone down the formal analysis, I didn't even cite other works of mine or of others who are analyzing formally the different types of architecture I showed. One of the reasons I chose to do that was to highlight precisely the need to speak in other terms, to speak of a local culture in terms of climate and forms was something that was done throughout early in the 20th century, even before modernization movements. And there's a need to step out of that as well. The other speakers also pointed that out. So today was not a time to discuss, in any case, I chose to speak more on three methodological frameworks and not unveil all the details of the architectural historical research, but that's all.
Okay, so we'll end our session with the last question from the audience.
More than a question is a comment, and it has to do with historical research. And I would like to go back to the issue of Pan-Arabism, for example. Pan-Arabism did not started with Bandung. In the 1920s, 1930s, there were already intellectuals from the Arab world who were gathering. And in the case of architects, interestingly enough, it started in 1945 in Alexandria by Palestinian architects. Okay, so this is 1 year before the Arab League. And so it shows that we might want to see things top down, but we also have to see them bottom up. And the figure of the professional in the 1940s and even before was a very strong one. And these people had faith and thought they could do things. And in the pages of El Amara, for example, they have this Al-Mutamar al-Handasi al-Arabi, who were convening every year. So Al-Mutamar al-Handasi al-Arabi, it's the Congress, the technical, technical Congress, or Congress of Arab Engineering Congress, okay, every 2 years. And they gathered in different cities in the region, and they met and they talked, and they thought they were, they had something important to say and something important. And El Amara was supporting exactly this. So I think we need to be more careful. And the problem of looking at these things from abroad, in a way, to join is that you miss all these things. If you don't read Arabic, you don't understand what is going on and you can't read the El Amara starting with. And you miss all these connections and all these discussions that are not only transregional, actually, because, for example, Egyptian architects were also the first ones to be member of international organizations, les Réunions Internationales d'Architecture, for example. And they stopped going to these meetings when the currency, control on currency, made that they could not pay the fees to, belong to this organization. So there is a whole, history there. And yes, I think you need Arabic to get into that history some way or another.
Okay.
Thank you very much. We have a break of 2 hours now, and we convene for the second session. Thank you very much.